An extraordinary event occurred within the monarchy at precisely 3 minutes past the hour. Not a declaration from the palace, not a spokesperson, not a release with much filtering. Instead, decades of royal instinct were broken by a single voice that was well known for its discipline, temperance, and unwavering devotion to duty, Princess Anne said. And when she did, one thing became horrifyingly evident due to the weight of her remarks. It was much more serious than anyone had anticipated what had occurred to Prince Louis. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. Her existence, rather than the volume of her speech, was shocking. Throughout her public existence, Princess Anne has maintained a regulated distance. She does not readily provide consolation. In times of intense emotion, she doesn't come forward. She is typically not the one addressing the fracture itself, but rather the one silently keeping the system together when crises arise. This is the exact reason this moment came down so hard. The normal norms did not apply if Anne was speaking now. Every royal newsroom was alarmed by the timing alone. It is not a coincidence that it is 3 minutes past the hour. It's not normal. Royal pronouncements are designed to be predictable and symmetrical. Or come. None of those things applied here. It was an interruption. It conveyed urgency rather than formality. The institution's internal rhythm had been disturbed by something, compelling a response that could no longer wait for perfection. Experienced journalists froze inside press rooms. Scripts were dropped in the middle of sentences. From desk to desk, phones lit up with the same silent message. This isn't comforting. Damage control is not what this is. This is a very different matter. It was almost immediately reinforced by Anne's tone. There were no soothing words or phrases intended to calm the populace. She spoke with weight rather than friendliness. They sounded calm but unimpressed, thoughtful but not unrestricted. The finality that lurked between her statements was what most unnerved the audience. Phases were not mentioned by her. She made no mention of surveillance. She made no mention of hope. Rather, her tone was one of someone recognizing a boundary that had already been crossed. Every pause felt deliberate. Every omission sounded louder than the words themselves. The question that no one could ignore then arose. Why Anne? Why now? William, why not? Whose voice the country identifies as being vulnerable? Why not Catherine, whose compassion has helped the family weather past storms? The simplicity of the response was unsettling. This was not an emotional occasion. It was a gravity moment. Because Anne's voice doesn't tremble unless the ground beneath it does, she was picked. Attentive listeners started analyzing her wording. There were no words that typically indicate a brief interruption. There were no assurances. Even the tense she used emphasized permanence as opposed to transit. It was not someone buying time who said these things. They came from someone who understood the consequences, and one reality weighed heavy on the country as the hush returned after she had finished speaking. There was more to the story than this. It was the point at which the narrative could no longer be contained. However, we must examine what had been going on behind the royal walls long before the general public realized something was amiss in order to comprehend why Princess Anne's statements had such deadly force. The palace used deliberate omissions and half-sentences for months. Where worry should have been, smiles emerged. Explanation was replaced by silence. And Prince Louis, the royal family's most outwardly happy child, started to disappear. No deadlines, no official statements, and no guarantees. The public was unaware that the palace wasn't hiding information to preserve privacy. The truth had no words yet, so it was being withheld. A creeping unraveling has already started inside Buckingham Palace's gates. Once renowned for their exquisite accuracy and symbolic gestures, royal communications took a subdued but unsettling turn. The length of statements decreased. Once a regular feature of family updates, mentions to Prince Louis became infrequent, ambiguous, and then non-existent. However, Insiders were worried by something other than what was being said. It was the thing that was consistently omitted, the conscious decision to take his name off any school-related events, the lack of even the tiniest pictures, the steadfast refusal to use the word well. Diplomacy was not what this was. Evasion was what this was. Although it appeared to the outer world to be just a family looking for space, those skilled in deciphering the monarchy's language could already detect it. The quiet wasn't serene. Rather, it was calculated. And that approach was breaking down inside the organization. The advisors were divided. Some thought that being honest would incite panic. Others cautioned that the little control that remained would be destroyed if this emotional blackout persisted. They drafted, examined, and finally rejected the word temporary withdrawal. It was too dishonest, too optimistic, because nobody in the palace really thought that this was only transitory. Even worse, Louis's rare visits over the previous few months suddenly had a new, eerie significance. Once praised for its charm, the footage now revealed something completely different. Once regarded as fun curiosity, his big eyes now appeared far away. On a second look, his once popularly loved cheeky moments were strained. Those fleeting flashes were warning signs concealed in plain sight, not signs of happiness. In private discussions, a few assistants acknowledged that they had sensed a problem. They had witnessed it. I heard it. The lengthy conversational gaps, the unwillingness to give public speeches, the meticulously planned excursions that were abruptly canceled. However, acknowledging that a royal child had a problem was not just challenging, but also risky within the palace apparatus. Reputations were on the line, pictures to keep up, protocols to follow. Thus, the appearance of normalcy was maintained, brick by painful brick. However, maintaining illusions takes energy, and that energy was quickly depleting. The emotional toll within private quarters was growing. The people closest to Louis were protecting themselves from the intolerable reality that he was slipping, rather than protecting him from public scrutiny. What started out as a break in his routine turned into a void. Suffocating distance replaced what had started out as a protecting silence. Then suddenly, the whispers were no longer private. Palisades ceased using the word manageable. In private, senior advisors started going over long-term strategies for a time when Louis might never be in the public eye again. Everything changed from bewilderment to silent horror at that point. The quiet could not last any longer. Furthermore, the facts could no longer be contained. Additionally, as the ambiguity increased, the parents who were forced to live with two realities at once were crushed, not simply advisors or authorities. The future king and queen were disintegrating behind closed doors, rather than planning their appearance. Every choice felt incorrect. All the smiles felt fake. William and Catherine were caught between two intolerable roles: institution guardians and parents who watch their child fall into something they can't identify, can't stop, and can't outrun. And it wasn't what they did that was the most eerie. They discovered it far too late. William had grown up within the confines of performance, where headlines quantify weakness and emotion is controlled. However, despite his decades of training, he was unprepared for this. Slowly, like a dull ache he attempted to ignore, the remorse started. It was only a phase, he told himself. He was a routine person. But suddenly, every indication that had gone unnoticed replayed in his thoughts with unbearable clarity. Louis's refusal to go in the morning, the evenings he requested to remain at home. William was more than just a father who failed to notice the indications. He was a future king who was too focused on upholding his legacy to notice the disintegration taking place in his own house. A distinct responsibility fell on Catherine, who was always the family's calm pillar. She carried the silent burden of keeping everyone together: William, George, and Charlotte, including the domestic workers. She passed from room to room like a calm river, concealing her own dread behind placatory gestures. But fatigue lay beneath that exterior. Emotional tiredness, because she sensed it every time she glanced at her youngest. Something is slipping. Something is getting dimmer. Even if she made an effort to articulate and explain it, the palace lacked a public vocabulary for such a breakdown. Not in private either. Royal customs turned into the family's shield. School drop-offs, appearances, and photo shoots are all carefully orchestrated to provide the appearance of normalcy. But behind the ceremonial smiles and camera flashes, things were getting worse. It was more than Louis's retreat. The whole home was on the verge of disintegrating. George became more subdued. Charlotte held her brother tighter. Laughter-filled moments gave way to a gloomy silence. Never before had the palace halls felt so eerily silent and reverberating. They were torn apart by the conflict between instinct and anticipation. Catherine was reminded of the cameras each time she reached for her son's hand. William was reminded of his responsibility each time he thought about taking a step back. Their titles were now burdens rather than markers of stability. And the worst insight arrived slowly and brutally. They had confined Louis in an attempt to keep him safe. They had made the stillness even worse by protecting him from the sound. It was no coincidence that he was alone. Line by line, it had been written by well-meaning people who were blinded by royalty. Then came the time they were unable to ignore. "We thought we were helping," William confessed to Catherine one peaceful evening in a voice strained with denial. Everything was revealed by her silence. They weren't thinking how to mend things for the first time. The bubble had burst. The illusion had fallen apart. They questioned whether it was too late already. However, one royal figure recognized the pattern immediately because she had experienced it previously, while William and Catherine were crumbling under the strain. Princess Anne made no request for approval. When she feels that history is being repeated, she never does. Anne noticed something eerily familiar as committees discussed language and optics, the same emotional suffocation that had previously ruined others. She wasn't going to let silence win this time, and her next move would subtly defy custom, etiquette, and the unwritten guidelines that often guide royal crisis management. She had seen it before. Agony disguising itself as stoicism, children lost in the name of legacy, and pain pushed under rugs of royal duty. She had long since buried those regrets, but her detachment was shattered by the signals surrounding Prince Louis. It was happening again in the palace. One more kid, another generation. Anne could no longer watch when she saw it. Anne moved with purpose, even as the institution seemed stuck in contemplation. Bypassing all channels, she took up the phone and called William directly. Not as a royal, not as an advisor, but as his sister. Those who saw William afterward recognized that what was spoken in that conversation had changed everything and was not consoling, even though it would never be written down. She provided guidance. She informed him that the palace lacked the necessary tools to resolve this, that Louis did not require royally clad therapists, physicians, and consultants. There was no need to control him. He had to be taken away from the palace, the media, and the stresses that no youngster should have to endure. He could not be saved any other way, and avoided using hypotheticals when speaking. She exposed it. The institution was keeping the water steady while the child drowned. William paid attention, and for the first time in months, he began to listen to something deeper, his fatherly instinct. Instead of waiting for palace approval, the intricacy of her answer wasn't novel. Its simplicity was radical, and made no recommendations for private clinics, programs, or facilities. She recommended liberty, without secrecy, silence. Structure without examination. There were days that started with something as simple as strolling outside, feeding the animals, and ending without cameras. She had witnessed the effects of strict regularity on other people. She was determined to break it now, and without a prearranged departure or notification. Prince Louis was discreetly taken out of the public eye. There were no statements made. There were no justifications provided. However, the choice caused quiet commotion inside the palace. It was wrong, yet officials weren't furious. The fact that it was not authorized infuriated them. By making a royal choice without the crown's approval, Anne had gone too far. In addition to upending the chain of command, she served as a reminder to everyone that institutional approval is not necessarily necessary for moral clarity. There were murmurs of unease among the employees. She was accused of going too far by some. Others quietly acknowledged that she had done what no one else had the courage to do. But the talk didn't appeal to Anne. She had already witnessed the price of silence. She would not allow it to cost them once again. Something else started to move inside the palace as Prince Louis was discreetly taken out of sight. Something much less caring, more dangerous, and colder. It was not intended for the document to become public, stamped with confidentiality and written in an impartial style. It discussed management rather than healing, of exposure, not of a child. The memo didn't simply break when it got to William's hands. Have faith that it exposed the most sinister reality. Prince Louis was no longer seen by those at the institution as a boy or a son. He posed a risk. It came silently, slipped through channels covered in formal language and icy bureaucracy. Just the term contingency and reputational safeguarding measures told the story. The contents were terrible. It didn't give the youngster a loving name. Subject visibility was mentioned, emotional instability, and a persistent sense of danger. Only risk exposure diagrams, public absence schedules, and long-term disengagement choices were discussed. No suffering, sadness, or recovery were mentioned. In every aspect, it was a vanishing blueprint. To shield the crown from Louis, not to shield him. As he read it, William's hands shook. He was aware of the palace's potential for coldness. He had seen insensitive decisions made. However, this? His youngster was reduced to a risk profile and was being evaluated as a strategic burden. And it wasn't simply the words that were the worst. It was the very existence of the paper, created, examined, and discreetly distributed. No one had stopped it. It had gone through desks and been read by people he trusted. This is a child, not a calculation, had not been uttered by a single voice. Inside the palace, what transpired was explosive. William rarely yelled. He didn't have to. However, walls trembled that day. He barged into the offices of private advisors. He crushed the memo in his fist, demanding names, requiring responsibility. With the rage of a parent deceived, his voice pierced the antiseptic silence of the palace halls. He is not a story. He is not a helpless person. My son yelled so loudly that the aides on the next floor froze. Catherine had a different reaction, but it was just as terrible. She didn't speak louder. She didn't beg. Silently, she entered the room, occupied by senior advisors, gazed after setting the printed memo down on the table. Even the most experienced bureaucrat would cringe at the quiet. Then she uttered a single inquiry in a voice as cold as steel. If it were your child, would you talk like this? There was no response, because no one was able to justify what was written. Anne's response upon reading the paper was prompt and widely reported. She acted without waiting for approval. She didn't soften her voice. She condemned it as strategy disguised as cowardice. This wasn't only a leadership failure, in her opinion. It was the last proof of her long-held suspicions. The organization was emotionally bankrupt, in addition to being out of touch. It had now filed for bankruptcy. It all altered in the days that followed. It was now indisputable what had previously been said behind closed doors. In attempting to limit the damage, the palace had revealed its most serious weakness, the readiness to compromise one's humanity for one's reputation. Louis wasn't the only person the system had let down. It had attempted to remove him. The palace was unable to control the narrative when the document emerged, and the public's reaction was nothing short of seismic. When snippets were made public, an ancient thing broke. This was neither a scandal nor a gossip. It was a moral outcry. In Prince Louis, parents saw their own children. Decades of neglect were shown in black and white by mental health campaigners. Furthermore, the monarchy wasn't defending an error for the first time in contemporary history. It was protecting its humanity. It wasn't an accident. It was terrible, exact, and purposeful. Reputational risk, containment strategy, and long-term invisibility were among the icy terms used in the internal document that struck the public like a slap. These weren't words written with the general public in mind. They would never see the light of day. They were intended for silent chambers and whispered hallways. However, they ignited a firestorm when they did. As they read them live, news anchors shuddered. Betrayal screamed from the headlines. Social media exploded in rage rather than curiosity. In a matter of hours, pity for Prince Louis gave way to indignation at the establishment. The palace was no longer considered a home in mourning. It was presented as a frigid machine that may deprive a youngster of their identity in order to preserve a picture. Mental health groups voiced their outrage and urgency. Advocacy organizations, trauma specialists, and pediatric psychologists all submitted statements. They weren't merely critical of the wording. They denounced the underlying philosophy. The monarchy had presented itself as contemporary and progressive for many years. The illusion broke now. This was not royalty, it was regression. A public reckoning resulted from what had previously been a public worry. People wanted accountability for the system, not for a scandal. Inside the palace, the realization started to set in as the meticulously constructed story of subdued dignity crumbled under the weight of publicity. Silence was no longer a viable tactic. Not in a world where tradition has been surpassed by sensitivity. Not after the unfinished machinery behind the curtain was revealed to the public. The monarchy lost the moral high ground in addition to narrative control. Its stoicism was its strength for generations. From self-control. However, those same principles were now being reframed as carelessness. It was impossible to overlook the contrast. Others in the palace had attempted to erase their child in the name of damage control, while William and Catherine battled to keep him safe. Like a razor, that paradox sliced through popular confidence. Behind the palace gates, servants hurried. The messages were rewritten. The briefings were canceled. The question of how to react was hotly debated inside. However, it was too late. Another polished message was not what the public wanted. They desired the truth. And the palace realized for the first time that silence was not the only path ahead. It was by giving up. Giving up the mask. Letting go of the illusion of invulnerability. Giving up to something it had fought against for ages. The palace was compelled to confess the truth, a moment it had avoided for years due to emotional transparency, the erosion of trust, and growing pressure. No deflection, no euphemisms. Centuries of royal attitudes were rewritten in a single sentence. Prince Louis was recuperating emotionally. The statement was delivered discreetly rather than with fanfare, humbly, and with a burden that chilled the country. Power wasn't shown with poise for once. It was demonstrated by being truthful. The official statement was succinct. A wall that has stood for generations may be brought down with just a few lines. The crown recognized something unvarnished, human, and raw for the first time. Phrases like private time and temporary retreat were not carefully inserted. No words of distance, no suggestion of scandal, chaos, or sickness. Just the facts. The family thanked the public for their understanding, while Prince Louis continued to receive emotional care. The nation was astounded not only by the clarity, but also by its vulnerability. The monarchs did not use this phrase. It was motherhood's language, because Catherine's voice was hidden in every word. According to palace sources, she was instrumental in crafting the message and preventing it from being softened by procedure or filtered by PR departments. Her mark could be seen in the careful and exact wording, forceful but empathic, frank but dignified. The second communication, which was handwritten, arrived a few hours later, directly from Catherine. Not a crest, not a royal heading, just ink, feeling, and a clear departure from the institution's reserved tone. She withheld certain information. She didn't want to, but her words cut right through the cacophony. She acknowledged the weight of silence, thanked the people for their patience, and made one memorable statement. Until they are ready to be held, certain realities are too sensitive to disclose. It was a confession, not merely a note. It was a call to empathy, not inquiry. And it wasn't only read by the general public. They sensed it. Waves of reactions followed. People from homes, hospitals, and classrooms in Britain, Canada, Australia, and South Africa recognized themselves in the message. Parents who had stood up for the tranquility of their children. Before collapsing, teachers had observed disengagement. People in their adult years who wished someone had defended them in their youth. There was neither indignation nor sympathy. It was a show of solidarity since the royal family was actually experiencing it rather than just displaying fortitude. And something small but profound started to change as the globe took in what had just transpired. The basic measure of power, which the monarchy had been protecting for ages, started to change. It was no longer polished smiles or austere quiet, but the bravery to utter the unsaid, and in doing so, the monarchy gained significance rather than lost influence. However, the most impactful moment was saw rather than heard. There was only a youngster, hands smeared with dirt, and a mother kneeling next to him, no crowns, no castle background. The noise ceased as soon as the image emerged. There was no need for an explanation. Prince Louis was not making a symbolic comeback. He was coming back as a human. And the monarchy spoke more in that one picture than it had ever said. It didn't go through the proper channels. It wasn't prominently shown on the palace's social media. It came quietly, initially shared by a small mental health advocacy charity with no press release, no signature, and no acknowledgement. The weight of months of heartache, perplexity, quiet, and healing was contained in a single picture. And in a matter of seconds, the globe realized what it was. It is a declaration of survival rather than a return. The picture violated all royal regulations. There was no professional attire, no regal framing, no posing, and no eye contact with the camera. It was real, which is why it appeared real. And the impact of that reality was greater than that of any formal presentation. The people wasn't witnessing a prince for once. They had a boy in their sights, and that boy, who had formerly been the subject of horrifying conjecture, now just gazed at tranquility, not flawless, not resolved, but there. It was everything the world had been waiting for without realizing it. The caption was absent. There was no need for any. The quiet told it all. Optics has nothing to do with this. It had nothing to do with certainty. It was about an experience that could only be felt rather than captured, and thought it was. Among people who had followed the royal narrative for years or just weeks, across generations, across countries, it had an immediate emotional impact. Parents sobbed. People stopped. The news anchors deviated from the script. The image was visceral rather than viral. There was something primordial about it, human-like. We all comprehend it, but we hardly ever see it. Healing is ongoing. The story of Prince Louis, which had previously been dominated by headlines and hypotheses, was now being reframed, not as a secret, not as a controversy, but just to remind you, a reminder that vulnerability exists even for the world's safest youngsters, that suffering may enter palaces as well, and sometimes that strength, that true strength, looks like putting your hands in the ground next to the person you love and expressing your presence without using words. The change happened right away. The rumors subsided. There was a spike of empathy. The people granted space instead of demanding updates. The story of sorrow changed to one of resiliency. One photograph demonstrated it, not because a formal update announced it. The monarchs was aware that such a moment could not be produced. They didn't try because of this. And a last insight sunk in during that quiet. There was more than one child involved. Princess Anne didn't explain the catastrophe when she eventually spoke. It was to keep the next one from happening. Her remarks were protective but not sentimental. She also set a boundary that the institution could no longer exceed by speaking up. The tale of Prince Louis grew into a greater one, a pledge that history would not be permitted to repeat itself unchecked, a warning and a reckoning. For many years, Anne had been the monarchy's unwavering silence during turbulent times, unfazed by controversy and completely obedient. Beneath the stoicism, however, lay a painful memory bank. She had witnessed her mother's reaction to silence. She had seen Diana buried by it. She had seen William back down, Harry fall apart, and too many souls offered up in the name of duty quietly crumble. She decided that was enough after witnessing Louis vanish into the same icy machinery. She didn't raise her voice. It didn't shake. But when she did come forward, it cut like a razor through the generations. She didn't inquire. She was rendering a decision. Her statement sent shockwaves across the family, because Anne had never presented herself as a reformer or a rebel. The institution has always been upheld by her, despite the pain. This moment was so seismic because of that. The woman who had previously been the embodiment of tradition was now tearing apart the aspects of it that she realized were flawed. And in doing so, she turned into someone nobody saw coming, the monarch's conscience, by deed, not by sentiment. The change was evident on the inside. Within the palace, authority started to shift with moral weight rather than titles. Even her superiors listened to Anne when she spoke, and the outcome was indisputable, even though her influence was never presented as political. From then on, no decision about the royal children could proceed without addressing Louis's fate. He had turned into a line in the sand, a point of reference. It was drawn by Anne herself. The effects were generational and long-lasting. The palace could no longer regard its youngest members as visual accessories. Not after this. Not until someone had the guts to say, "Stop." After a crisis that had happened in real time, where stability was exchanged for the welfare of a child. Since Anne was Louis's aunt, she did not save him. She did it because she knew the power of unbridled silence. And she was aware that the cycle would resume invisibly and quietly if she did nothing. Another cover-up with another child? One more press release that mentioned nothing at all. Ultimately, Anne's promise was more than just a declaration. It set a new benchmark. She reminded the organization that legacy is more than just what you preserve, something it had lost in its fixation with appearances. What you leave behind is what it is. Additionally, by defending Louis, she altered the narrative that the monarchy will have to provide in the future, one that is not one of perfection, but of suffering, education, and transformation. And for the first time, there may be truth at the heart of that tale. Because the monarchy finally paid attention at 3 minutes past the hour, it wasn't just a tragic update. We appreciate you watching, and we hope to see you in the future one. Please remember to like and subscribe.